Welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week, Sam breaks down the highest yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics with your host Sam Smith. The goal of this podcast is to cover the highest yield topics on the MCAT and provide you with some sort of insight into the questions that the MCAT really likes to ask. This episode is going to cover a few of the classic psychology experiments to know for the MCAT. I'm going to talk about 12 different experiments in all. That'll include things like Pavlov's dogs. I'll talk about the Harlow monkey study. I'll talk about the Asch Conformity lion experiment. I'll talk about the Watson little Albert experiment and a few more. And what I'll do is I'll give you a little background on each of these experiments. I'll discuss some of the motivations behind the experiments, and then of course I'll talk about some of the takeaways, which is probably the most important part. And this material is going to show up on one out of the 4 MCAT sections. That's going to be the Psych-Soc section. And what's interesting to me is that many of these experiments could probably not be done today. Well, I would say definitely not done today. A lot of them are pretty unethical according to today's standards. So just keep that in mind as I talk about these things, and hopefully you find this podcast helpful as well as interesting. And what I've done in the show notes is I have listed off each of the experiments that I talk about and put a time that you can skip to in the podcast if you just want to listen to one or two of these experiments that you don't really understand well to get a better grip on it, then do it, just so you know that's available. So as I said in this podcast, I'm going to cover 12 different major classic psychology experiments that you should know for the MCAT. And I definitely have seen these come up in the MCAT, so something that's important, and hopefully once you've listened to this, you'll see a question or two about it on the MCAT. All right, so the first experiment I want to talk about is the Pavlov Dog Experiment that looked at classical conditioning. So Ivan Pavlov was a Russian psychologist who was born in 1849, died in 1936, and he actually won a Nobel Prize for physiology in 1904 in recognition for his work in the physiology of digestion. And originally what he did is he worked with dogs and was very interested in their digestive system. He was kind of one of the first researchers to really look at the interaction between the digestive system and the nervous system, which we now know there's a lot of communication there, and that's known as the gut-brain axis. But it was in his work with the dogs and their digestive system that he noticed that the dogs would actually salivate before the food was brought to them. And he was curious as to what external stimuli was actually causing this salivary response. Was it the sound of the food container that being opened that the dogs would hear and then they would salivate? Was it when they smelled the food they would salivate? Or was it something in his demeanor that, the dogs were kind of sensing and saying, okay, we're going to get fed, and then therefore they started salivating? What he came to find out was it was actually the footsteps of some of his assistants that were actually feeding the dogs that was the stimuli that caused them to salivate. So then what he did is he set up an experiment that would then lead to the development of this idea of classical conditioning. What he did is he hooked up the dogs' mouths to these tubes so that he could actually measure the amount of saliva that they were secreting. So you can go Google an image of this, but it kind of looks just like a metal rod that's basically sticking out of their face that's got a piece of piping that leads away from their face. And so as I said, it was actually the sound of his assistants walking around that would cause the dog to salivate, because to them that meant food. And so we wondered if it could be any stimulus that could set off this salivary response. So what he did is he presented the sound of a metronome and then gave the dogs food while he presented this sound. And after a few repetitions of doing this, the dogs actually started to salivate in response to this stimulus, which again was the metronome. And so in the end, what he did is he took this stimulus that didn't produce a response, right? You play a metronome around a dog, it's not going to do anything. And he paired that stimulus with a response that was innate, which was salivation. And so this is what he called classical conditioning, and he went on to do a bunch more experiments to understand it better. But this is kind of the classical conditioning experiment. I also think it's important to understand the meaning of some of these different psychology terms that describe this classical conditioning process. So I'm going to kind of break this down using those terms, the unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and so forth. So we start out with these dogs that have some unconditioned response. right? That's just their innate response to food, which is to salivate. And with that, they have an unconditioned stimulus, just the natural stimulus that they react to and start salivating, which in this case was the sound of the assistant's footsteps. And now what classical conditioning does is it takes a neutral stimulus, which is a stimulus that does not elicit the response that you're interested in, which in this case was the ticking of the metronome, and it pairs that neutral stimulus with the response that you are interested in. And so again, that is the innate response, which is also called the unconditioned response. But when you pair that neutral stimulus, which again was the metronome, with the unconditioned response, it becomes a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response, right? Now you present the ticking metronome and it produces a response in the dogs and the dogs start salivating. So now those two are paired and they're called the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. And TV commercials actually like to do this shit to you. Think about like a Sprite commercial. What usually happens is they'll have this can of Sprite and you open it and it's got this crisp, refreshing noise. And then they pour it into a cup and the person drinks it and then they go, ah, after they drink it. And those noises are just like refreshing, crisp noises. It makes you think, man, that sounds really refreshing. So after you hear that a few times and you think to yourself, that sounds refreshing, you eventually start to, or I guess I shouldn't generalize this to you, maybe you're smarter. You start to associate that can of Sprite with refreshing. You pair the stimulus of the Sprite can with that response, which is, oh man, that sounds refreshing, that used to be paired with the noise. And then the next time maybe you're walking through the store, you see a Sprite bottle and you're like, man, that looks refreshing. And then you buy the Sprite. The next study I want to talk about here is the Harlow monkey study. And a lot of these studies are pretty questionable in terms of their ethics today, but I think this one is especially so. It seems a little cruel, almost like torture. I'm not on an IRB board, so I don't really know exactly what the ethics standards say, but as you'll see, this seems a little bit questionable. So Harry Harlow was born in 1905 and died in 1981, and he was a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that was really interested in the bond between children and their mothers, which led him to do the famous Harlow monkey study. And he was really interested in exploring how mothers and infants form this lifelong bond. He wanted to know if this was something that was based in physiology or was it based in something emotional or psychological. He was just really curious how that bond worked. So here's how his experiment went that he set up to answer these questions. What he did is he took a few rhesus macaques that were newborns, and rhesus macaques are just these small monkeys, and he would actually separate these baby monkeys from their mothers and actually take them to his own lab. And apparently a little backstory, but when he first got to UW-Madison, the school didn't give him enough lab space, so he actually purchased a building across the street from the school and turned it into a primate research lab that he called the Psychology Primate Laboratory. So anyways, he takes these baby monkeys to his Psychology Primate Laboratory, and he places them with two surrogate mothers. And these surrogate mothers weren't real monkeys. One of them was made of this terry cloth, which is like this wash rag material. And then the other mother was made of wire. And the wire mother actually had the baby's food. So you got one cloth mother and you've got a wire mother that has food. And essentially the baby monkey could go back and forth between the two mothers as it pleased. And Harlow was really interested in which mother the monkeys would spend most of their time with. Right? Because if this bond between mothers and infants was only a physiological bond, then you'd think it would spend more time with the wire mother because that's where the food was. It would meet its physiological needs. However, if the connection was more of an emotional connection or there is some other mechanism behind the connection between these mothers and infants, then we might see the baby monkey spend more time with the terry cloth mother. What Harlow saw was that the baby monkeys actually spent very little time with the wire mother and instead spent the majority of their time with the terry cloth mother, kind of clinging onto the terry cloth and like cuddling up to the mother monkey, the surrogate mother monkey. To Harlow, what this suggested was that infant-mother connection was not just about the physiological needs. Instead, it was more about the emotional needs of that baby, the need to be touched and loved and cuddled. In another part of the experiment, what he did is he took the terry cloth mother and the little baby rhesus macaque monkey, and he put them in a new environment. And what the baby monkey would do is it would actually go around and kind of explore and be playful. And then if it found something new, sometimes it would be a little precautious, maybe go explore and then run back to its mom for safety, go explore more, run back to its mom for safety. However, if he just took the baby monkey and placed it in that new cage alone, well, he noticed that that baby monkey would have basically a freak out, right? It would scream and it would cry and would want that cloth mother to go with it. Then he got curious. He said, what if I take the wire mother and put it in with the baby into this new cage? What would happen? He saw the same thing happen as with the cloth mother. It had that confidence to go around and kind of explore because it associated the mother with being that protector. And so from this arm of the experiment, Harlow concluded that mothers play an important supportive role in social behavioral development and exploratory behavioral development. And if you're interested further in this experiment, you can go watch some YouTube videos. The baby monkeys are really cute, and it's kind of sad when they get freaked out when their mom's not around. And it's kind of sad to think that they were just taken from their mothers. But it was a very interesting experiment. And again, I don't think it's necessarily ethical at this point in time, but it was done and the results are interesting. The next experiment I want to talk about is called the Bobo Doll Experiment. And this was done by Albert Bandura, who was a professor at Stanford and again was a psychologist. And he's actually still living. He's 94 years old. If you look at a picture of him, he looks kind of like a skinny version of the grandpa from Up. So just have that in your mind as you listen to this experiment. So he was interested in vicarious learning, modeling, and imitation. And he was specifically interested in how children pick up behaviors from their parents or other role models in their lives. And this is his most well-known experiment, the Bobo Doll Experiment, and the one you're most likely to see on the MCAT. And so his experiment was like this. He took 72 children between the ages of 3 and 6 years old from the Stanford University Nursery School, I'm guessing with the parents' permission, and they were given a baseline test first to gauge their intrinsic levels of aggression. Next, he took the children and separated them into 3 groups of 24, and each of these groups was matched for aggression, meaning that, say for instance, I had 3 highly aggressive children that ranked highly aggressive on whatever scale he was using, then he would separate those children into different groups so that like the average aggression of each group was roughly the same. And you'll see in a sec why that's important. Now, each of these 3 groups was exposed to a different kind of video and then allowed to go into a room with a bunch of toys, including this Bobo doll. And a Bobo doll is just like this big blow-up clown-looking thing that like if you hit, it's got weights in the bottom so it'll kind of swing around and then swing back up. I don't know, I played around with one as a kid, so you'll know what I mean if you've ever seen one of these. But what's important about this experiment is that each of these groups watched a different video before being exposed to this Bobo doll toy room. So group 1 watched a video in which an adult was actually beating up and saying disparaging things to the Bobo doll. The person in this video was like beating up the Bobo doll with a mallet, kicking it, throwing it in the air, and yelling obscenities such as sock him, hit him down, kick him, throw him to the Bobo doll. So that's group 1. Group 2 watched a video in which an adult was quietly playing in basically a subdued manner with some of the other toys in the room and kind of ignoring the Bobo doll. And then group 3 was the control group. They didn't watch any video, and then they were just placed in that same room. And I want to make it clear, in the original experiment, these kids were placed in the room alone. So you imagine the kid watching a video, and then they're placed in this playroom alone. What Bandura found was pretty much what he expected. He saw that the children who viewed this aggressive, mean video before they went into the playroom were much more likely to act aggressively towards the doll, whereas the children who didn't watch the video or watched the nice video were much less likely to act aggressively towards the doll. And this supported the theory that Bandura is known for, which is the social learning theory. And the social learning theory basically says that children learn social behaviors, such as aggression in this example, through the process of observational learning, which just means that they're basically watching others' behaviors around them, specifically adults, and then learning those behaviors by doing so. All right, so that's Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment that supports this theory that he came up with called the social learning theory. The next experiment I want to talk about is one that was done by a man known as Burris Frederick Skinner, or B.F. Skinner, and it involved a box. So B.F. Skinner was a Harvard University psychologist who was born in 1904 and died in 1990. And he was really interested in behaviorism, which is just a theory of learning that basically suggests that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. And interestingly, he's credited with multiple inventions, one of which includes a pigeon-guided missile, which is literally exactly what it sounds like, a pigeon that is stowed in like the cone of a missile and uses its pecker to actually guide the missile along. And this actually never came to fruition, but it is interesting, I guess. I think once radar got more evolved, they kind of used that instead of pigeons, which is good. But another one of his inventions was the Skinner box, which brings me to one of his most well-known experiments and one that you may see come up on the MCAT, and that was the Skinner box and operant conditioning experiment. So first of all, I want to introduce the idea of operant conditioning. I talked a little bit about classical conditioning, but operant conditioning is the idea that you can strengthen behavior through reinforcement and reduce behavior through punishments. So it's a type of associative learning, a little different than classical conditioning, but just kind of understand that it has more to do with punishments and rewards and shaping behavior over time. If you're really interested, you can go listen to the podcast I did on learning. But anyways, Skinner developed and invented this small box in which he was able to actually study behavior and study operant conditioning. And so essentially the box housed one animal, which was typically a rat, although he did studies with rabbits and I believe mice, as well as some other animals. And these boxes all had kind of the same features. They had an electrified grid that the animal stood on so that electric shocks could be delivered to the animal. It had a loudspeaker. It had a lever that the animal could press. It had a food dispenser, and it had lights. But in terms of the classic experiment I'm going to talk about, you can really just focus on the lever in the food dispenser. So what BF would do is he would take a rat, and BF is a funny name. He would take a rat and he would place it inside of his box, and he would first teach it to press the lever, and he would do this by giving them a reward for pressing the lever. And what was the reward? Well, he would just drop a piece of food each time the lever was pressed. And it was all mechanized, so each time the rat pressed the lever, it would actually drop the food in. And one thing he noticed right away was that if he stopped presenting the food as a reward for this behavior of pressing the lever, then this behavior would stop. And he called this extinction. And in general, extinction is the decline or stopping of a response once the reinforcement is removed. So in this case, of course, the mouse behavior that stops is pressing the lever, and that's because they stop receiving food for doing so. And Skinner went on to do a bunch of different experiments with these boxes. One that I've seen and that I think is interesting is when he experimented with different schedules of reinforcement. And so he looked at 5 different schedules of reinforcement. And what I mean by schedules of different reinforcement are the way that reinforcements are provided, food, again in this case, for the behavior, which is pressing the lever. So you can have continuous reinforcement, which is the very first case I presented, where you have the rat positively reinforced every time the lever press occurs. So each time the lever press occurs, the rat will get the pellet of food and will be happy. However, this has a really fast extinction rate, meaning that if I stop providing that food pellet for each time the mouse presses the lever, it's going to stop pressing the lever pretty fast. So again, that's continuous reinforcement. The second schedule of reinforcement he looked at was called fixed ratio reinforcement, which essentially means that behavior is reinforced only after the behavior occurs a specific number of times. So for instance, this would be every 5th push of the lever, the mouse gets 1 food pellet. And this works decently well. The extinction rate is somewhere in the middle. It's like a medium extinction rate, meaning they'll continue to press the lever for a little bit after they stop getting food. Longer than continuous reinforcement, but still not that long. The next schedule of reinforcement was called fixed interval reinforcement, which essentially says that there's 1 reinforcement given after a fixed period of time. In other words, the mouse would get 1 pellet of food every 5 minutes, say, no matter how much it pressed the lever. I would assume this extinction rate is even greater than the fixed ratio reinforcement, but not really. It's still in that medium category in terms of its extinction rate. It lasts a little bit longer than the continuous reinforcement, but still not that long. The 4th schedule of reinforcement that he looked at was what he called the variable ratio reinforcement, which essentially says that behavior is reinforced after an unpredictable number of responses. So for example, the mouse would press the lever a variable amount of times each time they received a little pellet of food. So one time they may have to press the lever 4 times and they receive the food. The next might be 20. The next might be 1. The one after that might be 50. And so it changes each time and is therefore very unpredictable. And because of this unpredictability, the extinction rate is very, very slow. And this is one of the reasons that those slot machines are so dangerous, right? Because they run on a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. In other words, it's very hard for the person playing the game to predict when they're going to get a jackpot. Because there is no set schedule of there being jackpots, right? It happens at unpredictable times, even though people think they can predict it. And, they think, oh, I'm so close, I'm just going to go for one more, even though that's not how the machine is programmed. Again, so that is variable ratio reinforcement, which is a very low extinction rate. The next and last reinforcement schedule I want to talk about here is called variable interval reinforcement, which is similar to the one I just talked about. But this is when after providing one correct response or pressing the lever, reinforcement is provided after some unpredictable amount of time. So assume, let's say that the rat has pressed the lever. Now they're given a reward after 5 minutes. Well, then the next time they'll press the lever again, the reward is given after 13 minutes. The next time it's given after 2 minutes, and it's just random time after each lever press. And again, because this is so unpredictable, the extinction rate is very slow. The last term I want to talk about here, and I mentioned it in the kind of intro to this experiment, was the term shaping. And all that means is that one can slowly shape the behavior of whatever subject you're looking at, whether that be human or mouse or some other animal, over time using operant conditioning. So you kind of slowly mold this behavior into the one that you like over time using operant conditioning, and that is shaping. So through his experiments and through the Skinner box, B.F. Skinner was able to kind of concoct and experiment on this theory that he developed known as operant conditioning, which basically says that behavior can be reinforced by rewards and discouraged by punishments. And of course, there's more than that, and you can find that on the Learning Podcast. The next psychology experiment I want to talk about is called the Asch Conformity Experiment, or the Asch Line Experiment. And this was done by Solomon Asch, who was a psychologist who immigrated from Poland, was born in 1907 and died in 1996. And he moved to the United States at the age of 13, got his PhD right when World War II was just starting. And he became really interested in Hitler as well as the Nazi regime in general. And was really specifically interested in propaganda and indoctrination. And that's kind of the backdrop to this experiment and what got him interested in it. And so what he did for this now famous line experiment is that he started with a group of participants and actually told them that they were going to take part in a visual acuity test. And what he did is he would show each of these subjects a card with a series of lines on it. So on the left side of the card, there would be a single line, and this was kind of the reference line. And then on the right side of the card, there were 3 lines of varying lengths, each labeled either A, B, or C. And the job of the participant was to look at this reference line on the left side and pick which of the 3 lines was the same length on the right side of the card, which is a pretty easy thing to do. Like if you go Google what these cards look like, it was pretty easy to see, which line it matched up with on the right side. It wasn't like they're all really close together and you actually had to be able to see to do this. That wasn't the actual experiment. And so what he did is he then took 8 to 10 people and he put them in a room, and he would have people answer down a line. Starting with the person in the front of the room, he'd say, okay, which line do you think matches the reference line? And they'd say A. He'd go to the next person. What do you think? A. And they just go down the line. And what the subjects didn't know is that they were actually surrounded by a bunch of fake subjects. These were all actors planted by the researchers. And so they could control the answer that these other people gave. And what they did is they placed the subjects near the end of the line, meaning they would be like the 8th person to answer. And what they did is they had these actors at first answer correctly. So at first they'd give the right answer when he said, okay, what line do you think matches the reference line? They'd say A, down the line. And that would be the right answer. But then over time, what they did is they would give obviously wrong answers. So they'd say, okay, on the 5th card, I want you to say C, even though that's not the right matching line. So they'd start at the front of the line and they say, what line do you think matches the reference line? It'd be C, 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 C. And then by the time it got to this participant, what they're interested in is they're interested if the participant would go along with these actors and pick the wrong answer that they knew was wrong, or would they go against the group and pick the correct answer? And he said that anytime someone chose the wrong answer to go along with the group, that was quote unquote conforming. And so what he found in this experiment was that 75% of people actually conformed at least once, which is pretty interesting in my opinion. 75% of people, that's a lot. Of course, that leaves 25% who never conformed once. That's still a great chunk of people that just are going along with the group. And more interestingly, Asch found that if he had just one of the fake subjects answer correctly, then only about 5% of people conformed. And he argued that this was evidence that having a minority group of dissenters in a larger group can have big effects on group decisions, right? If you're that one person in a group who is dissenting at some opinion, you're not very likely to actually express that out loud. But if you know you have others who are also willing to express that dissenting opinion, then you're more likely to then express that opinion, right? You've got all these other people backing you up. That's pretty intuitive, and I think that makes sense and is an interesting result of this experiment. The next experiment I want to talk about is called the Milgram Experiment, and it was done by Stanley Milgram, who was a Yale psychologist, born in 1933, died in 1948. And like Asch, he was really influenced by World War II in the Nazi regime. And around the time of this experiment, Adolf Eichmann was on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And for those of you who don't know who Eichmann was, he was a high-ranking Nazi official that was in charge of coordinating what was called the, quote, final solution to the Jewish question, end quote, which was mass execution, which is horrible and sad. And in effect, he was the chief executioner of the Nazi regime. And so that's kind of the backdrop to Milgram's experiment. And what Milgram was really curious about was he was curious if Eichmann and these other Nazis were really these horrible people, or if they were just following the orders given to them from someone above them. And so this led him to conceive of his now famous and very controversial experiment. So here's the experiment. He started by recruiting a bunch of subjects, and they're between the ages of about 20 and 50 years of age. And he did this using an advertisement in the Yale newspaper. And these were people from many different walks of life, different professions, but I will mention that they were all men. And so what he told the subjects when they walked in was that he was studying the effect of punishment on learning and memory. He was not, in fact, studying the effect of punishment on learning and memory. In all, there were 3 people that took part in each session of the experiment, but only one of these was an actual real participant. The other were actors. And so the only real participant was called the quote-unquote teacher. And then there was one participant that was an actor that was called the experimenter, and they were this stern-looking person who was carrying a clipboard or something and looked like they were a researcher involved in the study. And then the third was a, quote, learner, who was on the other side of a wall so that they could not be viewed by the teacher, and they were also an actor. The experimenter would stand behind the teacher as the teacher would ask the learner questions. So you could imagine you've got this really official-looking researcher who looks like they're taking notes as this subject, who is a real subject, is asking an actor questions. And they're asking this actor questions through a speaker system because there's a wall that divides them so they can't actually see each other. Now, the teacher was told that for every time the learner gets a question wrong, they were to be shocked. And not only were they to be shocked, but at each wrong question they got, they were to be shocked in an increasingly severe manner. And during this process, the learner, who again was an actor, would make noises as if they were getting shocked and it was really painful. And what's actually funny about this experiment is that the only real shock that was delivered during this whole test was one that was given to the teachers themselves at the beginning of the experiment, just so they could see what it felt like. And I think this was really just to add a little bit of authenticity to the experiment. You know, if you're a participant in this experiment and the experimenter sits you down and says, okay, you're going to be delivering shocks, here's what one feels like. maybe it makes it a little bit more real in your head and you think you're actually delivering these shocks and you don't see through to the true purpose of the experiment. The shocking instrument itself, I think, is described really well in this Cal Berkeley textbook by a Mr. Encina. It says that, quote, shock levels were labeled from 15 to 450 volts. Besides the numerical scale, verbal anger is added to the frightful appearance of the instrument. Beginning from the lower end, jolt levels were labeled slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, and extreme intensity shock. The next two anchors were labeled danger, severe shock, and past that it was simply a ghastly XXX. So this machine was pretty scary looking, or I guess you could say it looked pretty legit. And so in response to these supposed shocks, the learner, which was again an actor, would begin to grunt at 75 volts. They would complain a little bit at 120 volts, and then at 150 volts, they'd ask to be released. And then they'd continue to plead and let out screams and stuff as the voltage was increased. And then eventually, in desperation, the learner would yell really loudly and start complaining of heart pain. Once the learner was jolted with a 330 volt shock, the learner, who again was an actor, would be totally silent as if the shock had actually killed them. And what's worse is the teachers were told to treat the silence as if it was an incorrect answer. And then they were supposed to apply the next shock level to that student who was supposedly dead and not responding to anything the teacher was saying. And if at any point the teacher, who was a real participant, hesitated to actually inflict the shock, the experimenter behind them would tell them, no, continue, go on. They'd pressure them to continue to shock this learner. And they would use scripted statements like, this experiment requires that you continue. So this whole time you could imagine that the teacher just has this constant pressure from this very official looking person behind them to continue to deliver shocks to this person who seems to be in complete agony as they get questions wrong. So what were the results of this experiment? What Milgram found out was that 65% of the men in this experiment went all the way, meaning that they administered the fake 450 volts of electricity. And this was, again, if you remember back to what I said earlier, this was even after the learner had apparently died and was non-responsive. 65%, that's a majority of the men in this experiment. This result has actually been reproduced many times. It's not like one of those old experiments that's out of date and the results of it can't be replicated. It's been replicated a lot of times, and there's a meta-analysis, a bunch of different studies that are similar to this that show that an average of 61% of participants are actually willing to go all the way in terms of shock. And you may not be all that surprised that so many men were willing to go all the way, but Milgram was pretty surprised. It had been predicted by a bunch of psychiatrists that less than 1% of people would be willing to go to the fullest shock level, which again was 450 volts here. The results from this experiment then would suggest that a majority of people that were doing bad things in Nazi Germany, and they were part of the Nazi regime, were doing so because they were following orders. And that would especially apply to people who can't see the victims themselves, right? In this experiment, the victim was behind a wall. And so that especially applies to people who are high up in the Nazi regime and weren't out there in the field seeing these horrible things that were going on. And of course, there's been a lot of critics who have argued that this is a situation much different than that in Nazi Germany and doesn't have any applicability. They've also pointed out that this is not really an ethically sound experiment. The participants were experiencing a lot of emotional stress, right? They just thought they killed somebody. Nonetheless, I think this is a pretty interesting experiment, and the results of it honestly make me a little bit uncomfortable to think that maybe these people were just following orders, that were doing these horrible things.
Thanks for checking out the Prospective Doctor MCAT Basics podcast. Sam's doing a killer job taking you through the most important MCAT topics, but what if you need a little extra help? How does a 5, 10, or even 15-point increase in your score sound? Imagine how your chances at admission could increase. Med School Coach's MCAT tutoring can get you there. With the most rigorous selection process of any tutoring company, we see amazing results. We deconstruct each student, find a plan that is going to work, and help execute it. That's why our students add an average 12 points to their score. completely physician-run and operated, and focusing on nothing but medicine. It's no wonder over 10,000 past students have trusted Med School Coach to get them through the MCAT and into medical school. Check out medschoolcoach.com today and mention code PODCAST for 5% off.
All right, so the next experiment I want to talk about here is the Watson Little Albert experiment. So John B. Watson was another psychologist who was born in 1878, died in 1958, and he's most known for founding behaviorism, which is the idea that all behaviors are acquired through conditioning. I talked about that a little bit earlier with Pavlov and also my boy BF. And this Little Albert experiment was pretty similar to Pavlov's dog experiment, but to me it took it a little step further because it was an experiment done on humans, and in this case a little baby whose name or nickname was Albert, which is a horrible nickname for a baby, right? I don't know a baby named Albert. Seems like an old man's name. Anyways, the experiment goes like this, and it's actually pretty simple. Watson took a baby with its parents' permission, I'm guessing, and what he wanted to do was classically condition this baby to react to a certain stimuli. And what he wanted to train it to do is actually become scared at the sight of a mouse. And so what he did is he started with the response that he wanted, which is fear. And in this case, it was an unconditioned response. And he noticed that he could get fear out of a baby using loud noises. So that was the unconditioned stimulus, right? He made a loud noise, the baby would get fearful. And so what he did then is he brought out a neutral stimulus, which was this little cute white lab rat. And he let Albert play with it. And Bert showed no aversion to this mouse at all. He was having fun playing with it. He really liked it. Now, the mouse was removed. The next time he brought that mouse back out, each time Albert tried to touch it or reach out for it, Dr. Watson took a metal hammer and like a metal pipe and just hit it really hard, making a really loud noise right behind Bert. And so what happened was that Bert actually learned to associate fear with this cute little mice because of that loud noise that was being generated each time he tried to touch the cute white mouse. In other words, he was able to pair an unconditioned response, which was fear, with a neutral stimulus, which was a cute white mouse, and that is classical conditioning. Further, what Watson recognized was that Albert actually seemed to generalize his fearful response to the mouse. In other words, he would react with fear towards anything that even resembled the mouse at all. So one thing that they brought out were white cotton balls. And these white cotton balls were actually able to make Bert cry, which is sad, but brings up an important concept to know for psychology and for the MCAT, which is generalization. And generalization is the tendency for someone or something to respond in the same way to different but similar stimuli. And this experiment has obvious problems, right? It's, first of all, an N of 1. You only have one participant, and you are clearly causing a baby some emotional distress, which is not ethical. So there's that, but it is a cool experiment in that you can see a pretty clear example of classical conditioning in humans. So that is the Little Albert experiment that was done by John B. Watson. The next experiment I want to talk about is called the Sherif Robber's Cave experiment, which was done by Muzaffer Sherif. Shareef is a Turkish social psychologist, say that 5 times fast, and he was born in 1906, died in 1998, and he was really interested in social psychology, which is just a branch of psychology that is interested in social interactions. Makes sense. And he was specifically interested in research on human relations within and between groups, which is where this famous Robber's Cave experiment comes from. Shareef had this hypothesis, and his hypothesis was that intergroup conflict, which is just conflict between groups, occurs when 2 groups are competing for a limited resource. And so this experiment itself was sort of Lord of the Flies-esque. Basically, he took 22 Boy Scouts and randomly assigned them to one of 2 groups. It's important to note that none of the kids actually knew each other before this experiment. And so once Shareef made these 2 groups, he sent the Boy Scouts off to a camp at a 200-acre Boy Scout ranch in the Robbers Cave State Park, which is in Oklahoma. And for 1 week, the 2 11-boy groups were kept separate from each other, i.e. they had no contact. They were pretty close to each other. They were a few miles away in the same ranch, but they never were allowed to interact with each other. And what this allowed was for each group to kind of become tight-knit and form a close group. And they even went so far as to come up with group names for themselves. One group was named the Rattlers, and the other came up with the name the Eagles. And after this 1 week was up, each group was told that they would be competing with the other group in a series of games. And these were like basketball, tug of war, touch football, tent pitching, all these different games. And to up the ante, the researchers told them that the overall winner from all these games was to receive a really nice, big, attractive, shiny trophy. What happened next is that the tension between these two groups flared. They both took turns destroying each other's flag at one point. Again, they were the Eagles and the Rattlers, and they each had their own flag. So each group destroyed the other's flags. And then they planned sneak attacks where they snuck into the other's cabins and ransacked the place. And eventually it escalated to the point where one group of boys actually filled up their socks with stones, kind of tied them off, and were going to use them as weapons to defend themselves if the opposing group came back to their cabin. And so at this point, of course, the camp counselors, who were the experiment observers, had to step in. You can't literally replicate what happens in Lord of the Flies. That would be bad. And so this is all to say that the two groups really grew to despise one another. They really kind of hated each other. And what Shareef took away from this was that he was able to show that he could raise tensions between two groups by presenting some limited resource. And in this case, the limited resource was a trophy that was to be awarded to one group. And so he went on to kind of confirm his original hypothesis. But then later he was interested in ways that he could actually reduce this tension. And what he found was that he could reduce the tension between these two groups by having them compete towards a similar goal. For instance, what they did in this experiment is they purposefully broke the water system and then had both groups work together to get it fixed and back up and running. So in the end, this psychologist, Sherif, was convinced that his hypothesis was indeed correct, that when you had two groups competing for some limited resource, that caused conflict. And he went on to try to apply this to real-world situations, and he said that essentially mere contact between different groups of people is not enough to get along. Instead, these different groups of people need to actually align their goals and cooperate together in order to have a positive intergroup relationship. The next experiment I want to talk about is one that was done by a psychologist named Martin Seligman, and it was called the Learned Helplessness Dog Experiment, or at least that's what I'm calling it. He was born in 1942. He is now 72 years old, so he's still living, one of the few that I'm talking about on here that's still living. And it was Seligman, along with another psychologist, that was really interested in depression, and specifically the concept of learned helplessness. And during the time Selig was working on a project in which he was subjecting dogs to electrical shocks, he noticed a really interesting phenomena. And to understand this phenomena, you have to understand a little bit about what he was doing. So he essentially had these dogs in a cage in which half the floor of the cage was electrified and the other half was not. And in order to get between the two sides of the cages, the dogs had to jump over this little gate kind of in the middle of the cage. And so I think the important thing here is that the dogs could go back and forth between the electrified side and the non-electrified side. They could control that. And so what he noticed is that in the usual case, when a dog was shocked, right, it'd jump over the barrier and get to the non-electrified side because it didn't want to be shocked. But when a dog was subjected to continuously random shocks, he noticed that over time it would start to not even try to escape. It would just sit there. And so to investigate this further, he designed the following experiment. He got together a bunch of new dogs and divided them up into 3 groups. The first group of dogs were strapped into a harness and were not administered to any shocks. The second group of dogs were strapped into the same harness, but were administered electric shocks that could be avoided if they pressed their nose against a panel. Then the third group of dogs were placed in the same harness and were given electrical shocks, but there's no way to avoid them. Then he took each of these dogs that had been strapped in and either shocked or not shocked, and he put them back into these cages that I previously described. And what he noticed, and what you probably would assume to be the case, is that the dogs that were in the harness and given electrical shocks with no way to avoid them didn't even try to escape the shocks in this half-electrified cage. And Martin developed his theory of learned helplessness based upon this experiment. And he said learned helplessness is when someone or some animal learns to act helpless in a situation based upon its previous experience, even though it can act to change its circumstance. In other words, in this experiment, the animal, which was a dog, perceived that stopping the shocks was out of its control. So it was like, why should I even try to move? I can't change this. And what he went on to believe is that this was one of the main drivers of human depression. All right, so the last thing I want to do here is do 3 rapid fire experiments / patients, and you'll see what I mean. The first one I want to talk about is the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment. And this is a pretty fraught experiment, very controversial now. I think someone that was in the experiment came out recently and said that they had been asked to act a certain way. And so we don't really know if this was actually a legit experiment. But what happened is they fake arrested a bunch of subjects who signed up for this study during the summer. And they were brought into a makeshift prison in Stanford. And then there were other subjects recruited to be prison guards. And pretty quickly, the experiment devolved and inmates started acting kind of weird. The prison guards started bullying the inmates, and the experiment was stopped early because these interactions were becoming so dehumanized in a way. And so they just evolved into these horrible interactions. And so Zimbardo concluded, and this is from his notes, quote, "I watched some normal, healthy, intelligent, and mature young men become dehumanized into emotionally disturbed, quote, prisoners, end quote, full of hatred, while others were transformed into oppressive, brutal guards. It was as if we were all in a play by Pandriello, directed by Kafka, in which we began with a simulated, unreal prison experiment, and with 1 week we ended with the reality of actually being imprisoned. Then, I was made aware of the pervasive control which forces in the social environment can exert upon individual behavior. Control so powerful that it could influence virtually all aspects of a person's thinking, feeling, and acting, yet so subtle that he and outsiders looking in would constantly underestimate its potency," end quote. And that's a whole lot of words to say that the environment that people are in have a lot to do with how they act. And some of the critics of this experiment say that the Hawthorne Effect actually undermines this whole experiment. And you should know what the Hawthorne Effect is for the MCAT. And so the Hawthorne Effect is when people act differently than they would in real life because they know they're being watched. So I think that probably played a decent role in this experiment if it's real. You know that you're not actually in prison, but you're being watched, so you kind of want to put on a show. And then, of course, as I said earlier, people have claimed this whole experiment is fraudulent and not what it seemed. The next rapid fire case I want to talk about is that of Kitty Genovese, who was a patient. She was a 28-year-old human woman who was stabbed outside of her apartment in 1964 in Queens, New York. And right after her murder, the New York Times published an article weeks after the murder claiming that 38 people had heard or seen the murder and had failed to step in and act or even call the police. And now there's a pretty big dispute as to whether this is true or fake news, but don't worry about that, just pretend it's true. Because this is a classic example of the bystander effect, which says that individuals are less likely to help a victim when others are present. What I imagine is these 38 people all looking at each other like, you do something, no, you do something, no, you do something. And I should mention too that there's actually an inverse dose-response relationship with this bystander effect. And what I mean by that is that the greater number of bystanders you have, the less likely it is that one of them will help. So if this had been 100 people, then this bystander effect may have been worse, according to what we know in psychology today. The last case I want to talk about in this rapid fire section is the man with a pole in his head. And he was a patient, and his name was Phineas Gage. And he was actually working on a railroad when, by accident, a metal rod was driven through his head and destroyed much of his left frontal lobe. And apparently the wound bled pretty bad right after this. I mean, obviously you have a hole in your head. And it became infected after the rod was removed. And he was really close to death during the peak of this infection. They thought he would die, but he ended up making a full recovery. And you'll see why it wasn't full. Interestingly, his memory was fine, and we know why that is. The memory has more to do with other parts of the brain, specifically the hippocampus. What didn't recover, though, was his personality. So basically, he went from being a really hardworking man to being a lazy, profanity-spewing fellow. And this gave doctors at the time a really fascinating case study that helped them look at the role of the frontal lobe and of the frontal cortex. And what we know now is that these both play a role in judgment, impulse control, social and sexual behavior, and other of these higher order functions. All right, so that concludes this episode of Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics. As always, thanks for listening, and I hope this episode helped in your studies. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps other people see us. Tell your friends, your neighbors, your children, everybody, your dog. I really appreciate it. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Prospective Doctors MCAT Podcast. If you're a pre-med, you'll want to check out prospectivedoctor.com for tons of free tools, articles, and more podcasts that cover your pre-med life. And if you need help on the MCAT or getting into med school, check out medschoolcoach.com for the experts.